Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the virtual home of Congregation Shar HaShamayim and Tuesday Night Learning. I am, of course, Cantor Gideon Zellermeyer, and I'm joined by Rabbi Adam Shire, and we have some excellent guests this evening, and let's get right to it. But first, just a quick comment. It's not often that I get to wear a tie these days, but tonight I'm wearing one in particular, a particular tie. And for those of you who can try to figure out why this tie, you can put it later on in the Q&A and we'll get to it. But to tonight's guest, she is considered one of the foremost explanatory writers and literary stylists in American journalism. Margalit Fox retired in June 2018, not from writing, but from writing as a 24-year career New York Times obituary writer. She has written the page one send-offs of some of the best known and most central cultural figures of our era, including the pioneering feminist Betty Friedan, the writer Maya Angelou, poets Seamus Heaney and Adrienne Rich, the children's author Maurice Sendak, the advice columnists Dear Abby and Ann Landers. She has also written the obituaries of many of the unsung heroes who have managed to touch history rather quietly and anonymously, among them the inventors of the Frisbee, the crash test dummy, the plastic lawn flamingo, and even the barcode. She is the author of a number of books, notably Talking Hands, What Sign Language Reveals About the Mind, and The Riddle of the Labyrinth, The Quest to Crack an Ancient Code, which was selected by the Times Book Review as one of the 100 best books of the year and received the 2014 Soroyan Prize for International Writing. She's here to talk about her latest book, which I confess I heard about from her own mouth the first time I met her when I was touring the New York Times, and I was asked by a mutual friend who's here with us tonight, what part of the Times would you like to see? And I said the obituaries, because I want to meet Margalit Fox, because one of the most famous obituaries that for me she wrote was of the longtime maitre d' of the Concord Hotel in the Catskills. If you look it up online, it is phenomenal. Her writing is featured prominently in many style guides, including by Shar HaShamayim's own Steven Pinker in his book, The Sense of Style. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our virtual home, overdue by a year because she was supposed to be with us in person last year before the world fell apart. Margalit Fox, welcome to Shar HaShamayim.
Thank you so much, Cantor. Thank you, Rabbi, and special thanks to Louis and to Robin for making this appearance as if by magic possible in the way that we have appearances now. And thank you all so much for coming. I'm only sorry not to be with you in person, but B'Shana Haba'ah, we shall see. So as I get our lovely PowerPoint started, let me tell you how our time together will be organized. I am going to start with a brief reading from Conan Doyle for the Defense. I will then speak for about 35 minutes on this remarkable true crime story centering on a case that would become known as the Scottish Dreyfus Affair. And after that, we will throw the floor open to your questions. So come along with me now to the scene of a murder in Edwardian Glasgow and to an innocent Jewish man's trial and conviction for that murder in Edinburgh, nearby. But first, let's go 200 miles to the north to Peterhead, the northernmost point on Scotland's east coast, for it is here that our hero, Oscar Slater, was incarcerated for nearly 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. And it is here, in the winter of 1925, that our story begins. I will read to you now from the introduction to Conan Doyle for the Defense. It's titled Prisoner 2988. On January 23rd, 1925, William Gordon, lately known as Prisoner 2988, was released from His Majesty's Prison, Peterhead, a Victorian fortress on Scotland's raw northeast coast. Gordon would very likely have passed into history unremarked, except for his possession of a vital anatomical feature. He wore dentures, and beneath his dentures that day, furled into a tiny pellet with a scrap of glazed paper rolled round it to keep it dry, he carried an urgent note from a fellow convict. Though prison officials had made a thorough search of Gordon before releasing him, no one thought to examine his gums, and so the message, which would culminate nearly 3 years later in Oscar Slater's release from life at hard labor, was spirited into the world. Where earlier efforts to free Slater had been initiated by lawyers, this last desperate stratagem was set in motion by Slater himself. He had slipped Gordon the note, written in pencil on a fragment of brown tissue paper, at a meeting of the Prison Debating Society. A clandestine pellet like this was the safest means of communication between them. Like most British prisons of its era, Peterhead maintained a regimen of enforced silence. Prisoners who were supervised around the clock by armed guards were allowed to speak to one another only in direct connection with their work. Slater's message, now fragile and faded, has been preserved in the archives of the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. And this is it. I have held it in my hand. Bearing many of the hallmarks of Slater's idiosyncratic spelling, punctuation, and syntax, it reads, "Gordon, my boy, I wish you in every way the best of luck, and if you feel inclined, then please do what you can for me. Give to the English public your opinion regarding me personally and also in other respects. You have been for 5 years in close contact with me, and so you are quite fit to do so. Friend, keep out of prison, but especially out of this God-forsaken hole. Farewell, Gordon. We likely may never see us again, but let us live in hope that it may be otherwise. Your friend, Oscar Slater. P.S. Don't forget to write or see Conan D." That Gordon carried out Slater's instructions can be gleaned from a second communication, an anonymous letter that reached Peterhead in mid-February. Addressed to Slater, it said, "Just a few lines to try to cheer you up. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle bids me say that you have all his sympathy, and all the weight of his interest will be put in the scale on your behalf. We should like to get a line from you, if you are allowed to write. In the meantime, keep up your heart and hope for the best, and rest assured we are doing our utmost for you." This letter, which prison officials strongly suspected came from Gordon, was suppressed on arrival. But though Slater didn't know it, his anxious note had accomplished its purpose. It persuaded Conan Doyle, who had long sought, with immense energy but disheartening results, to commute his sentence, to take up the case one last time. The crime for which Oscar Slater had barely escaped the hangman's noose was stunningly violent. Its victim, 82-year-old Marion Gilchrist, was refined and wealthy. Under great pressure to solve the case, the police soon announced that they had a suspect, 36-year-old Oscar Slater, who had arrived in Glasgow that year with his young French mistress, nominally a music hall singer, but probably a prostitute. In the eyes of Edwardian Glasgow, Oscar Slater was in every way a desirable culprit. He was a foreigner, a native of Germany, and a Jew. His dandified demi-monde life affronted the sensibilities of the age. Slater billed himself variously as a dentist and a dealer in precious stones. This is one of his actual spurious business cards, but he was believed to earn his living as a gambler. Even before the murder, the Glasgow police had been monitoring him in the hope of having him arrested as a pimp. What I love is, in the decorous diction of the times, the charge that they sought to press was called immoral housekeeping. I've been guilty of that myself. Slater's trial took place in Edinburgh in May of 1909, with the case against him founded on circumstantial evidence and outright fabrication. The jury deliberated for just 70 minutes before finding Slater guilty, and the judge sentenced him to hang. The pronouncement had a terrible finality. There was no criminal appeals court in Scotland then. Pardons, when they were occasionally granted, were by prerogative of the British monarch. By the time, nearly 3 weeks later, that Slater's sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life, he had made arrangements for his own burial. Transported to Peterhead, he paced his tiny cell, hewed granite, and railed at his jailers for much of the next 2 decades. This is a reconstructed Peterhead cell. The prison is now a museum. In late 1911 or early 1912, Slater's lawyers asked Conan Doyle to lend his support to their cause. Though he deplored Slater's ungentlemanly life, Conan Doyle, a Scotsman himself, soon came to believe that the case was a stain on the British character. He trained his diagnostic eye on every aspect of the crime, manhunt, and trial, wrote The Case of Oscar Slater, his scathing 1912 indictment of the affair, penned a stream of letters to British newspapers, and lobbied some of the most powerful officials in Britain. The reprieve came at last in November 1927. In 1928, after a criminal appeals court was established in Scotland, Slater's trial was reviewed and his conviction quashed. The hearing, which Conan Doyle covered for a British newspaper, marked the only time in their long association that he and Slater met face to face. And then, after the triumphant resolution, came a bitter, highly public rupture. All these developments form the long, painful sequel to an exceptionally strange event that occurred in Glasgow in December 1908, about a week before the death of Marion Gilchrist. Though the fact would not be widely known for years, Miss Gilchrist told at least one person that week that she knew she was going to be murdered. Thus ends our introduction. I first encountered the Oscar Slater story more than 30 years ago. Commuting to work one morning on the New York City subway, I had brought with me to read John Dixon Carr's 1949 biography of Conan Doyle. Toward the end of the book, almost in passing, Carr notes that Conan Doyle investigated several actual criminal cases, including exonerating a man wrongly convicted of murder. A few pages on the Slater case followed. I almost dropped the book in the middle of the A train. Arthur Conan Doyle had played detective himself in a real-life murder case. Why in the world wasn't this story better known? Exactly why this remarkable tale slipped into a crevice in history was one of 2 central questions that I set out to answer in the course of my research. And I'll come back to both of those questions and their answers before our time together is up. But first, let us go to the crime scene. So come with me now back to Glasgow, to a quiet, upper middle class neighborhood in the center of town, to a street called Queen's Terrace and through the front door of number 14. And these are all period photographs from the actual crime scene. Follow me up the stairs to the first landing, to the front door of Marion Gilchrist's flat, and inside to her front hall. I want you to take a closer look at Miss Gilchrist's front door. Note the 1, 2, 3 locks. Miss Gilchrist was fearful of robbery and of murder, and perhaps she had reason to be, for she was a single woman of great wealth. For someone of her time and class, Marion Gilchrist lived fairly unostentatiously, but she did have one great indulgence: jewelry. She owned rings set with diamonds, emeralds, and rubies, bracelets of gold, silver, and turquoise, pearl and diamond necklaces, diamond earrings, and a great deal else. This is the inventory by the police of her jewelry made after her death, and as you see, it goes on and on and on. Miss Gilchrist seemed especially fond of brooches, and her collection contained a spate of them, including, faithfully for Oscar Slater, a crescent-shaped brooch set with diamonds. Miss Gilchrist lived alone, except for her maid, a 21-year-old Scotswoman named Helen Lambie. At 7 o'clock on the evening of December 21st, 1908, as Miss Gilchrist sat by the dining room fire reading a magazine, Lambie stepped out to buy the evening paper. During her 10-minute absence, a man entered Miss Gilchrist's flat. There was no sign of forced entry, so she appeared to have let him in, something she never would have done had a stranger called. We will never know who that visitor was or what transpired between them, but we do know that when Lambie returned at 7:10, she saw a man hurriedly leaving the flat. She entered to find the dining room awash in blood and her mistress on the floor, bludgeoned beyond recognition. Miss Gilchrist died moments later. The police were summoned, and Lambie told them that despite the immense hoard of jewelry in the flat, only a single piece was missing: a brooch in the shape of a crescent moon, set along its length with diamonds. This is the jeweler's sketch of the actual brooch when it was being made for Marion Gilchrist. 4 days later, the Glasgow police got a tip that a German Jewish immigrant, Oscar Slater, had recently pawned a diamond crescent brooch. Slater also had the misfortune to live less than 5 minutes walk from Marion Gilchrist's home. I have done that walk many times. It is very, very close. Had it not been for his notorious wrongful conviction, Oscar Slater would likely have passed through history without leaving a mark, for he was very much an immigrant everyman. He was born Oskar Josef Leszczyner in 1872 in Silesia in the German Empire. He grew up poor, roguish, footloose, and clever, though by his own admission, not book smart. As a young man, Oscar lit out for foreign shores, and during the late 19th and early 20th centuries lived in Paris, London, New York, and on several occasions in Glasgow. To accommodate Britons who struggled with Leszczyna and its unwieldy clump of consonants, he began calling himself Oscar Slater. A Beau Brummel whose dapper appearance belied his modest station in life, Slater earned his living through billiards, card playing, racetrack betting, and occasional dealing in secondhand jewelry. The marginal world in which he moved, a Runyon-esque milieu of gamblers, touts, music hall performers, and ladies of the evening, made Edwardian bourgeoisie convulse with horror. But in fact, it was a world in which a great many Jewish immigrants, lacking the capital, social acceptance, or language skills to make it in polite society, found themselves upon coming to Britain. On December 26, 1908, the day after they learned about Slater's pawn brooch, Glasgow police traced it to a local pawn shop, and they brought the maid, Helen Lambie, there to examine it. It was the wrong brooch, she said immediately. The brooch in the pawn shop had 3 rows of diamonds, whereas Miss Gilchrist's had only 1. Take another look. At that point, as Conan Doyle would write with Holmesian precision, the very bottom of the case has dropped out. The case of the police might well seem desperate after this, since if Slater were indeed guilty, it would mean that by pure chance they had pursued the right man. Yet they did pursue him, and pursued him nearly into the grave. Exactly why the police contrived to apprehend, try, and convict a man they knew to be innocent was the central question Conan Doyle set out to answer in his 1912 book on the case. And it was the second vital question that I sought to answer a century later in writing my own book. And that question, too, I'll come back to later on. But for the moment, our story shifts to North America in the weeks after Miss Gilchrist's murder. On Christmas night, 1908, Oscar Slater and his mistress left Scotland on a long-planned voyage to New York. Glasgow was then in the middle of an economic depression. Times were hard even for gamblers, and he wanted to make a fresh start in America. The police, however, chose to see the trip as a guilty man's flight from justice, and they wired the New York Police Department to apprehend him on arrival. In early January 1909, when Slater steamed into the port of New York aboard the Lusitania, and indeed it was that Lusitania, the ill-fated liner that would be sunk by a German U-boat a few years later, local authorities boarded the ship, arrested him, and threw him in the Tombs. Glasgow police detectives immediately sailed for New York to have him extradited. They took with them 3 witnesses who claimed to have seen a man resembling Slater fleeing Miss Gilchrist's building, including the maid, Helen Lambie. For the extradition hearing, those witnesses were coached, and perjury was suborned for the first of many times during Slater's 2-decade-long ordeal. 2 of the 3 witnesses, in fact, were shown Slater's photograph before being asked to identify him in chambers. Slater was returned to Scotland, and in the spring of 1909, he was put on trial in Edinburgh, and there he is in the dock between the 2 helmeted policemen. The case, with its patrician victim, shadowy immigrant suspect, and transatlantic manhunt, was by this time a worldwide sensation in the news. During Slater's 4-day trial, prosecution witnesses gave coached false testimony. Witnesses who could have alibied him were never called, and other exculpatory evidence was suppressed. The chief prosecutor made much of Slater's alleged pimping, a crime with which he had never been charged, as did the trial judge, the imposing Lord Guthrie. In his instructions to the jury before deliberations began, Lord Guthrie had this to say: "About his character, there is no doubt at all. He has maintained himself by the ruin of men and on the ruin of women, and he has lived in a way that many blackguards would scorn to live. A man of that kind has not the presumption of innocence in his favor. The jury took an hour and 10 minutes to convict Slater, and Lord Guthrie sentenced him to hang. Remember, Scotland had no criminal appeals court then, so a death sentence almost always meant death. This is actually the scribal copy of the sentence: be hanged by the neck upon a gibbet until he be dead. It couldn't be more chilling than that. However, there was enough public unease about the verdict that a petition drawn up on Slater's behalf garnered 20,000 signatures. His lawyers made a formal entreaty for mercy to the highest officials in the land, and 48 hours before Slater was to be hanged, he could literally hear them building the gallows outside his cell. King Edward VII commuted his sentence to life at hard labor, and so it was that in the summer of 1909, Oscar Slater was transported north to His Majesty's prison, Peterhead, and there he would remain for nearly 20 years. This is from the cell block floor looking up, photographed by me in 2014, and this, number 34, is Oscar Slater's cell. It's about 5 feet by 7 feet. As I researched Slater's story, nearly a century later, I was helped enormously by two immense archives on the case, one at the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh, the other at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. In 2014, I spent a week in each city poring over thousands of pages of documents and ordering photocopies of most of them. And about 6 months later, all those pages, including Slater's prison correspondence, witness statements, trial transcripts, police reports, and declassified British government memoranda about the case, landed with a great big thud on my doorstep in Manhattan. These are they. It took me the next year and a half to go through it all, but the treasures in those pages were beyond compare. In particular, the letters between Slater and 3 generations of his family back in Germany. For it is through those letters, many of which I quote in the book, that Oscar Slater becomes a flesh and blood human being. We see in his correspondence, for instance, his abiding love for his parents and theirs for him. My innocent Oscar, his mother, Paula Leszczyna, wrote in one of her earliest letters to him, "Don't lose courage, innocent of my heart. The sun will yet bring all to the light of day. The warmest kisses from your mother, who loves you with her last breath." Oh, is that a Jewish mother or what? But much of the correspondence is agonizing to read. In one letter home, Slater writes, "I have appealed for reprieve at least 7 to 8 times and always receive the same answer. There is no ground for interfering. You have no conception, dearest parents, without wishing to complain to you, how unhappy I often feel, and often I wish I was out of this world, if it were not for the thought of still possessing you in the outer world." Family finances kept the Leszczynas from traveling to Scotland, and through his nearly 20 years in Peterhead, Slater did not see a single member of his family, even once. To call Peterhead draconian is a huge understatement. An account by another convict of the period describes conditions there in unsparing detail. He writes, "The endless dreary days spent in the quarries, the harsh treatment, the coarse and badly served food, the punishment of dark cells and bread and water, The freezing winter nights in a cell in which not one particle of heat can enter, the blazing summer sun striking down upon your head in the dry and dusty quarry. Here is a photo of a group of inmates being escorted under armed guard to Peterhead's quarry in about 1930, just a few years after Slater's release. Here is the quarry train that prisoners had to load each day with immense blocks of granite. We can see what the years there did to Slater. This is what he looked like in 1909 when he entered Peterhead. He was then 37. This is what he looked like on his release in 1927 at 55. Oscar Slater would almost certainly have died in prison had it not been for the intervention of Arthur Conan Doyle. Though Conan Doyle is remembered today almost exclusively for Sherlock Holmes, in his own time he was equally well known as a humanist social crusader. Like Slater, he had grown up very poor, marginalized for his religion. He was a Roman Catholic, and very much not an Englishman. To the end of his long life, though he lived in England for decades, Conan Doyle retained a Scottish burr that you could cut with a knife. And it's clear from the causes he championed that Arthur Conan Doyle, by then one of the most famous and highest paid writers in the world, never lost sight of where he had come from. Among the issues for which he campaigned were the liberalization of divorce laws to help women escape abusive husbands, the exposure of Belgian atrocities in the Congo, he wrote a book about it, and clemency for his friend Roger Casement, convicted of treason. He also investigated true crime. Once the Sherlock Holmes stories had made him famous, members of the public began beseeching Conan Doyle to look into real life cases, deaths, disappearances, and so on, and he actually solved a number of them. Before the Slater case, his most famous foray into true crime was in helping exonerate George Edalji, an Anglo-Indian lawyer wrongly convicted of maiming livestock. And that case was the basis for Julian Barnes's acclaimed novel, Arthur and George. The most remarkable thing about Conan Doyle's vindication of Oscar Slater is that he did it entirely without benefit of modern forensics, but he had at his disposal two powerful weapons. First, that he was a master craftsman of detective stories, and second, that he was a doctor. To his true crime cases, Conan Doyle brought the rationalist mindset and meticulous powers of observation that he had first cultivated in medical school in the 1870s. And here he is as a new medical graduate. One of the deepest influences on the young Conan Doyle, both on his medical career and on his second calling as a detective writer, was his great medical school teacher, Professor Joseph Bell of Edinburgh University. Now, Bell came from a long, distinguished line of Scottish physicians. His grandfather, Sir Charles Bell, had identified the type of facial paralysis now known as Bell's palsy. Joseph Bell was famous for diagnostic powers that seemed to verge on sorcery. Conan Doyle would recall one especially memorable case in which Bell, lecturing to a class of students, was presented with a patient he had never seen. Conan Doyle writes, "He said to a civilian patient, 'Well, my man, you've served in the army.' 'Aye, sir.' 'Not long discharged?' 'No, sir.' 'A Highland regiment?' 'Aye, sir.' 'A non-commissioned officer?' 'Aye, sir.' 'Stationed at Barbados?' Aye, sir. You see, gentlemen, Bell would explain, the man was a respectful man, but did not remove his hat. They do not in the army, but he would have learned civilian ways had he been long discharged. He has an air of authority, and he is obviously Scottish. As to Barbados, his complaint is elephantiasis, which is West Indian and not British. Now, whom does that sound like? And indeed, as Conan Doyle readily acknowledged, Joseph Bell was the flesh and blood model for Sherlock Holmes, the scientific detective he set out to create when he began writing crime stories in the 1880s. In 1912, when Conan Doyle began his work on the Slater affair, he brought to the case the scientific method of just this kind. He scoured trial transcripts, witness statements, and newspaper clippings with a Holmesian eye, separating the genuinely revealing clues from a welter of narrative chaff, and just as Holmes did, making equally good use of negative evidence as of positive. I will leave the precise details of what Conan Doyle did and the precise conclusions he drew to those of you who have yet to read Conan Doyle for the defense. But I will tell you now that by the time Conan Doyle's book on the case was published in 1912, he had come to believe, as he wrote, that each clue against Slater crumbles to pieces when examined, and this unhappy man had, in all probability, no more to do with the murder than I had. But despite Conan Doyle's efforts, Slater remained in prison. The expose may simply have come too soon. Barely 4 years had elapsed since the Gilchrist murder, and the crime was still fresh in public memory. Oscar Slater would languish at Peterhead for another 15 years, and though Conan Doyle never forgot about him, he was occupied with other work. But in 1925, after he got the note smuggled under William Gordon's dentures, he took up arms once more. And at last, the time was right. Public sentiment against Slater had largely abated, and most of the principals in the original case against him were now dead. In 1927, Conan Doyle edited, published, and wrote an incisive introduction to The Truth About Oscar Slater, a new expose by the Scottish journalist William Park. That book, in turn, led to investigative series in several British newspapers, one of which tracked down Ms. Gilchrist's maid, Helen Lambie, then living in Peoria, Illinois, and got her to recant her original statement in which she named Slater as the man she saw fleeing the crime scene. Slater was released from Peterhead in late 1927, and his conviction quashed the next year. The case was Conan Doyle's last crusade as an investigator of true crime, and here is the fruit of that crusade: Oscar Slater looking dapper once more in the late 1920s. Now, the question that vexed Conan Doyle has persisted for more than a century, and it vexed me too. Why, when the police knew within a week of the murder that Slater was innocent, did they choose to pursue him all the same? And there is that second question, the one that seized hold of me that day on the A train when I first encountered this story. Why was the Slater case largely forgotten? In conclusion, I think I can answer both of those questions. Both answers are connected and both are, frankly, troubling. The answer to the first question, why did the pursuit of Slater go forward, is, strange as it sounds, that the Glasgow police had actually criminalized Oscar Slater before the crime was committed. Now remember, Slater had lived in Glasgow previously, and as a result of the shadowy world in which he moved, he was already known to the police. The journalist William Park found proof that when Slater resettled in Glasgow in October 1908, just 2 months before Miss Gilchrist's death, the police immediately began monitoring him to try to build a case against him as a pimp. And then for the police came the happy coincidence of the Gilchrist murder. It was an exceptionally high profile crime, and they were under exceptional pressure to arrest a suspect and get a conviction. It also happened to come at a time when many impoverished European Jews were settling in Britain, resulting in an upswing in British anti Semitism. So, for police and prosecutors in the Gilchrist case, Oscar Slater became what the historian Peter Gay calls the convenient other, a scapegoat who is different enough from the majority culture to trigger a kind of reflexive anxiety. And if that scapegoat can be routed from the community, there is the sense that the anxiety will be routed as well. In a 1927 letter to Conan Doyle, William Park wrote, "For some time before the murder, the police were watching Slater's house to get him on a charge of immoral housekeeping. This gives us a new theory altogether. Slater was being watched for another crime and was rolled into the Gilchrist case as a handy sort of fellow to convict. The further we go into this terrible business, we see nothing but the pure manufacture of a case." As I note in the book, the feeling among the police seemed to be that Oscar Slater might as well be hanged for a sheep as for a lamb, and he very nearly was. That brings us to the second question. Why did the Slater story slip into a crevice in history? Now, here I can only conjecture, but after having lived with the story for 6 years, I think it's at least an educated conjecture. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle died in 1930. In the decades that followed, a spate of biographies of him were published, including the one I was reading that day on the train. My surmise is that these biographers saw the Edwardian tragedy of the Slater affair as the dark vestige of some earlier time, a kind of dusty relic that could be dispatched in a few quick pages, and something that had little relevance to enlightened mid-century modernity. And yet, the Oscar Slater story is a tale of racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and aggressive legislative efforts to curb immigration. Not relevant to modern times? I'll let you all be the judge of that. Thank you for listening, but before we go to questions, since you all have been so kind to sit through the main meal, I have one little bonbon of dessert for you in the form of one more slide. When Conan Doyle for the Defense was published in 2018, I had the great good fortune of having a very favorable review in Time magazine. But what delighted me even more than the review itself was the fact that the review of this book, that is at its very core about Jewish identity, was laid out on the page right next to a gigantic advertisement for bacon. So thank you all so very much for listening. And now we will throw the virtual floor open to your questions.
Thank you so much for taking us on that amazing journey. It brings me back to my enjoyment when I first read this 2 summers ago, and there are so many fascinating twists and turns in this tale, and the way you bring it to life. I mean, it actually sort of harkens a little bit to your obituary career almost, in the sense that this seemed to me to be a grand reconstitution of the intersection between these two people, one absolutely remarkable in his life and accomplishments, and one rather unremarkable who probably wouldn't be remembered otherwise. Can you speak to that a little bit?
One of the things that I found so moving is we all, and I'm guilty of this too, when I started my research, we think of Conan Doyle as the way he's been, the kind of man who has been portrayed by actors in recent TV and movies. We think of him as this clubbable English gentleman. And he became that. But first of all, he was Scottish. Like Slater, he grew up desperately poor, beyond poor. He was one of 7 children, the eldest son. Conan, his father, tragic story, was alcoholic, epileptic, and mentally ill, taken away and locked away in a series of institutions. So young Arthur was basically the de facto head of this, as he said, this large and struggling family from very early. He was not a patrician wasp. They were um, from Irish Catholic stock living in Scotland. And he and Slater really had these remarkable commonalities of being very much marginal people. But of course, where they diverged was what happened in their adult lives. And as I said, one became a knight, the other became a knave, and for all the good that Conan Doyle did in this case, the ultimate tragedy was that neither one could really quite understand the other, perhaps not surprisingly.
One of our extremely observant members of our community, Carol Rockland, asks, can you tell us about the particular crescent-shaped brooch that you're wearing?
$10 on eBay. Many people have asked me, is that the brooch? And trust me, no freelance writer could ever afford a real diamond brooch, but I do like to wear this for appearances. I realize it's just, if I sit up tall, it's just showing up. But I have quite a collection of them, different sizes for different occasions, depending on the size of the haul. And so it's kind of fun.
Any telling what became of the Gilchrist jewelry collection?
The missing diamond brooch was never found. There are a lot of sort of grassy knoll type theorists around this case who've written, in my humble opinion, some really bad and not trustworthy books. One of them, I think, theorized that the maid Helen Lambie had worn the brooch and lost it, and so she made up the whole thing about its being missing. Another theorized there never was a brooch. So the brooch itself, if there was one, and clearly there was because we have the jeweler sketch from when it was made, that was never found. As to the disposition of her estate, it went, I don't want to, this would be a spoiler, but let's just say that Conan Doyle was shrewd enough to know that the assailant was probably not after jewelry at all. There were papers. A box had been broken into holding personal papers. There were papers scattered all around Miss Gilchrist's bedroom at the scene of the crime. And so he thought, what paper, save a will, would incite this kind of behavior? So as for her estate, let us just say it was substantial enough that certain people were fighting over it, and it may have been that one of those people wanted to hurry things along a little bit.
Understood. We'll have to leave the true answer firmly ensconced in the pages for the readers. One of our Commonwealth origin friends, David Brody, asks, did Slater have any Jewish connections in Glasgow?
There was a substantial Jewish community in Glasgow, and there's a section of the book that talks about it. One of the things I most regret having to leave on the cutting room floor was there was actually a Glaswegian Yiddish dialect where you'd have this wonderful mishmash of Yiddish and kind of Scottish underworld slang. Absolutely fascinating. There was a Jewish community, and they had kind of a push pull relationship with the Slater case. The Dreyfus case had happened only a few years before. Every one of them could well understand how the non-Jewish elite who ran a city could easily stitch up an immigrant Jew just because they didn't like him for a crime he didn't commit. They were very sympathetic in that sense. However, these Jews were reasonably assimilated by this point. They were very bourgeois, and so they really wanted to hold a gambler, possible pimp, even though that was never proved,
At
and
an arm's
someone
length.
who lived in this marginal world at arm's length. Exactly. There, the rabbi of the main congregation in Glasgow, the Garnet Hill Synagogue, actually helped Slater personally. But, and this will sound familiar, anyone who's dealt with synagogue boards, the board of the synagogue told the rabbi in no uncertain terms, if you help him, you're doing it as an individual, not as a representative of the congregation.
Fascinating. Uh, I know that you mentioned that Slater had some points of contact within his own family while he was in prison. What became of his descendants? I know that there is a tragic ending for some of them who remained in Europe.
One of the biggest Dafka moment of this, story that's kind of bitter and ironic from start to finish is that when Oscar Slater left prison in 1929, he was a man without a country. The British government, and there are very high level Home Office memorandums on this, the government wanted to deport him. And they would release him on condition of his being deportable. However, some quick research showed that in that era, a German who had been out of Germany for 10 years or more, which obviously he had been, lost his German citizenship. So, ironically, Oscar Slater had to stay in Scotland to the end of his life. This terrible case that took 20 years of his life but forced him to stay in Britain may well have saved his life. Oscar Slater died in his bed in 1948, in his 70s. I will say only, and the coda to the book talks about this, his beloved family who remained behind in Germany, whose letters are quoted in the book, did not fare nearly as well.
Since he did remain in Scotland, was there anything like a form of compensation that he received for this time for being wrongly convicted?
Yes, he got £6,000 from the British government, which is quite a lot in today's money, but that precipitated a bitter falling out with Conan Doyle. And again, the last chapter of the book talks about this. It was devastating to me to see, after I'd gone through thousands and thousands of pages of Conan Doyle trying to support Slater, the last, because boxes in the archive were organized chronologically, the last file in the box had a heading that made my blood run cold. It was Conan Doyle v. Slater. Conan Doyle actually had to sue him to try to get Slater to use some of that reparation money to compensate various people who had worked on the case, including Conan Doyle himself. Slater, of course, as this poor, panicked, long imprisoned immigrant, just was desperate to hang on to the money. And this was where I said, ultimately, they were both right. And ultimately, neither could understand the other.
Did they ever find? I mean, this is again the most spoiler worthy question. The actual killer?
No, it's not spoiler worthy because it can be answered in one word no. To this day, the actual killer is not known. Conan Doyle had a very, very strong theory, which I discuss in the book. So if you read the book, you will know who Conan Doyle believed the killer to be.
Right.
However, it couldn't be proved, and he was too good a man of honor, too careful a scientist, and too cautious as in his journalistic work to come out and say the name in public. But it's well known who he thought the killer was.
Two remaining questions. One is a sort of a comment and a speculative question. Doyle was a Germanophile. He had studied in German-speaking boarding schools before university, and even worked as a translator of German when he needed extra funds. Do you think this might be a reason that he took up this case, as Slater was German?
No, I don't think so. The salient thing, and this is actually what I find so beautiful about it, to the very end, he too held Slater at arm's length. He called him, even in his 1912 book, where he was trying to exonerate Slater, he said, Oscar Slater is a disreputable rolling stone of a man. You know, Conan Doyle was Victorian man from Central Casting. And so the shadowy world in which Slater moved, a world that Conan Doyle himself might well have found himself in the Edinburgh equivalent of if he hadn't pulled himself up, gone to university. Um, Slater's life horrified him, but what transcended that consideration was what Conan Doyle increasingly came to believe was a gross miscarriage of justice. And he knew that he could use his renown and his influence to try to reverse the case.
Before I come to our last question, I have to say I'm very disappointed in our viewership this evening. Nobody has come up with the fact that this is a tie made of the official Scottish Jewish tartan. I'm very disappointed, but there is such a thing. You can look it up online. Our mutual friend Andrea Canapel asks, it sounds like you were obsessed by this story. Did you have any dips in your interest during the course of this saga?
You know, it's interesting because it's been some years since I began working on it. I began working on it probably in 2013. I don't know if I would say I was obsessed, but I think I just had the interest that a writer of narrative nonfiction does to do something rigorously. And well, there was one point of obsession, and that was with Slater's correspondence. He was in prison so long that he wound up corresponding with three successive generations of his family. First his sisters, first his parents, then when the parents died, his sisters, and at the end his sisters' children. Those letters were all on file, thousands and thousands. Every letter he sent and received in 18 and a half years in prison had been kept. And the few earlier writers about the case really had made very little use of them. So, yes, with those and with the showing his Jewishness and his personhood, in spite of how distasteful he may have seemed to bourgeois people, yes, with that I was obsessed.
Well, before I leave this to the rabbi to wrap up, I just would like to say that I have a theory in my trying to take a page out of Conan Doyle that you were actually obsessed with this topic long before. Because as I said, when I read your that obituary that you wrote about Irving Cohen, the maître d' from the Concorde, I'm just going to read the following excerpt to you. Thanks to Mr. Cohen, many couples made matches. In the 1940s, he paired the Concorde's original clientele. In the 60s, he paired their children. In the 80s, he paired their children's children. Thus, simply by doing his job, which combined Holmesian deductive skill with Postian etiquette and a touch of cryptographic cloak and dagger, Mr. Cohen single-handedly helped perpetuate a branch of American Jewry. I don't know whether you remember writing that, but I think that given the journey you've taken us on this evening, it strikes a bell in my ear.
Well, maybe so. I mean, that said, I grant it, but the other argument is that Holmesian deductive skill is just kind of a cheap writer's shorthand when you're on deadline. So I think anyone might have used
You're
a phrase
too
like that.
modest. You're too modest. Rabbi Shire, take it away.
Wonderful. Before I thank Margalit Fox for the really extraordinary and engaging presentation this evening, I want to thank the Cantor not only for his participation and contribution, but also for lending me Conan Doyle for the Defense 2 years ago, right after he first read it. He shared it with me, and I loved it. I loved it as well, and for that reason, I anticipated this evening with great excitement. Thank you, Margalit, for your wonderful presentation. of this really fascinating and tragic story. The inspiration of Conan Doyle's acting, because he felt this injustice was an absolute stain on his country. The tragedy, of course, the wrongful conviction and incarceration, and the passing of Slater's family members while he was imprisoned, and the rupture after he was released. It was all there. And you asked why this story fell into the crevice of history. And I think an equally compelling question is, or an equally valid question is, why and how was it salvaged from that crevice of history? And thank you for allowing us to observe what it takes to discover a story and bring it to life in the way that you have this evening. We've been looking forward to this evening for a year now. For those who don't, Margalit Fox was originally scheduled to visit Shar HaShamayim on March 17th, 2020. And at the time, it was a difficult decision to cancel a lecture. In retrospect, it was obvious, but in the moment, it wasn't as simple.
It also would have been a tremendous conflict to talk about this on St. Patrick's Day.
Yes, and we are glad that we persisted. Margalit, glad that you were here. And as you opened with Lashana Haba'ah, next year, we hope that the future will bring us opportunities to get together in person for you and our congregation, and for all who are participating this evening. Thank you, everyone, for being here. A reminder that next week, on April 27th, we will welcome Professor Goldie Morgenthaler in conversation with Elaine Kelman. Professor Morgenthaler will be discussing her mother, Chava Rosenfarb's book, Confessions of a Yiddish Writer. So please go online and register for that event to receive the login information. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to do it at last.